The medical bay at Naval Base Coronado buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Dr. Sarah Chen moved between wounded Navy SEALs with practiced efficiency, her small frame belying the strength in her hands as she cleaned wounds and administered medication. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of the elite warriors who had just returned from a classified mission in Syria. "Doc, you're an angel," whispered Petty Officer Martinez as Sarah carefully stitched a deep gash on his forearm. His voice carried genuine gratitude mixed with the exhaustion that came after 36 hours of continuous combat operations. Sarah smiled softly but said nothing. She had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words in this world of alpha males and testosterone-fueled bravado. At 28, she had been the base medic for 3 years, earning respect through competence rather than conversation. The SEALs trusted her completely with their physical wounds, but they knew almost nothing about the woman who patched them up after each dangerous mission. Lieutenant Commander Jake Razor Thompson watched from across the room as Sarah worked. Even with a bullet graze across his shoulder, he couldn't help but notice how she moved with an almost military precision that seemed unusual for a civilian medical contractor. Her hands never shook, no matter how severe the injury. She had seen every kind of trauma the human body could endure, yet she remained calm and focused. "Chen, when you're done with Martinez, I need you to look at Reynolds," Jake called out. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. But when he spoke to Sarah, there was always an undertone of respect. Across the bay, Hospital Corpsman Reynolds lay on a gurney, his leg elevated and wrapped in blood-stained bandages. Shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had torn through his thigh, missing the femoral artery by mere millimeters. It was the kind of wound that could end a military career, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah finished with Martinez and moved to Reynolds' bedside. The young corpsman was pale, his lips pressed tight against the pain. She had worked on him before during training exercises, but this was different. This was real combat trauma, and the weight of it showed in his eyes. "How bad is it, Doc?" Reynolds asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah examined the wound carefully, her fingers probing gently around the shrapnel entry point. She had seen worse injuries in her time, much worse, but she kept that knowledge to herself. Instead, she focused on what Reynolds needed to hear. "You're going to be fine," she said quietly. "The shrapnel missed all the major vessels. We'll get you cleaned up and on the road to recovery." As she worked, cleaning the wound and preparing it for surgery, Sarah's mind wandered to another time, another place. Desert sand instead of sterile tile floors. The sound of incoming mortars instead of the gentle hum of air conditioning. She pushed the memories away as she always did, and concentrated on the task at hand. The other SEALs in the medical bay watched Sarah work with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. There was something about her that didn't quite fit the profile of a typical military contractor. She never flinched at the sight of blood. She never asked unnecessary questions about how injuries occurred. She understood military terminology without explanation and moved with an economy of motion that spoke of extensive training. Petty Officer Tank Williams, a massive man whose biceps strained against his uniform sleeves, had been coming to the medical bay for various injuries for 2 years. He had tried numerous times to engage Sarah in conversation beyond medical necessity, but she always deflected personal questions with professional politeness. "Doc's like a ghost," Tank had once told his teammates. "You know she's there, you know she's good at what she does, but you never really know who she is." That observation was more accurate than Tank realized. Sarah Chen lived her life in carefully constructed compartments. Her colleagues knew her as a competent medic who showed up early, stayed late, and never complained about the demanding work. Her apartment was sparse and functional, containing nothing that revealed her past. She had no photographs on display, no personal mementos, no indicators of a life lived before arriving at Coronado. The truth was that Sarah carried scars far deeper than any of the physical wounds she treated daily. She had learned to live with silence as her constant companion, finding comfort in the routine of medical care and the predictable rhythms of military life. The SEALs trusted her with their bodies, but she trusted no one with her history. As she finished treating Reynolds and prepared him for transport to the base hospital, Sarah caught Jake's eye across the room. He was studying her again with that intensity that made her uncomfortable. Jake had always been different from the other SEALs. Where others accepted her presence without question, He seemed to sense that there was more to her story. "Reynolds is ready for surgery," Sarah reported, stripping off her latex gloves and disposing of them in the medical waste container. "The wound is clean and I've started him on antibiotics as a precaution." Jake nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. "Good work, Doc. Same time tomorrow for follow-ups?" "Of course," Sarah replied, already beginning to clean her instruments and restock her supplies. As the wounded SEALs were transported to various treatment facilities and the medical bay emptied, Sarah remained behind to complete her paperwork and prepare for the next inevitable wave of injured warriors. This was her world now, sterile, predictable, and safe. She had built this life carefully, brick by brick, creating a barrier between who she was now and who she had been before. But walls built from secrets have a way of crumbling when the right pressure is applied, and tomorrow would bring pressures that Sarah Chen had never anticipated, forcing her to confront a past she had worked so hard to bury. The silence that had protected her for 3 years was about to be shattered by the very people she had dedicated her life to healing. In the quiet of the empty medical bay, Sarah allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She looked at her hands, steady and sure, hands that had saved lives and taken them. Tomorrow she would discover that some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, and that sometimes the people you least expect to understand are the ones who understand you best. The next morning arrived with the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across the training grounds. Sarah made her way to the medical bay, coffee in hand, watching through the windows as new SEAL candidates struggled through Hell Week exercises. The sight brought back memories she preferred to keep buried, but today those memories felt closer to the surface than usual. She had barely settled into her morning routine when the alarm klaxon sounded. 3 short blasts meant incoming casualties from a training accident. Sarah immediately shifted into emergency mode, checking her supplies and preparing treatment areas. Within minutes, she could hear the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching the landing pad, adjacent to the medical facility. The first casualty through the door was Petty Officer Davis, a young SEAL she had treated before for minor training injuries. This time was different. His face was pale with shock, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Behind him came 2 more SEALs supporting a third whose leg was clearly broken below the knee. "What happened?" Sarah asked as she guided Davis to an examination table. "Rappelling exercise went wrong," gasped Petty Officer Brooks, one of the uninjured SEALs. Davis hit the side of the building and Jackson's rope snapped about 15 feet from the ground. Sarah worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed Davis's injuries. Dislocated shoulder, possible broken collarbone, multiple contusions. Painful but not life-threatening. She administered pain medication and began the process of stabilizing him for transport to the base hospital. As she worked, more personnel began arriving in the medical bay. Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson appeared, despite the bandage still covering his shoulder wound from the previous day's mission. Behind him came Tank Williams and several other experienced SEALs who served as training instructors. "How bad is it, Doc?" Jake asked, positioning himself where he could observe both casualties without getting in Sarah's way. "Davis will be fine. Shoulder dislocation and some bruising. Jackson needs orthopedic surgery for the leg fracture. But it's a clean break. Both should make full recoveries." Jake nodded, but Sarah noticed he continued to watch her work with that same intense scrutiny that had made her uncomfortable the day before. There was something different in his expression today, a recognition that hadn't been there previously. As Sarah moved between the 2 injured SEALs, her muscle memory took over. She moved with an efficiency and confidence that came from treating combat injuries under pressure. Her commands to the corpsmen assisting her were crisp and authoritative. When Jackson's blood pressure dropped suddenly, she reacted instantly, adjusting his IV fluids and elevating his legs before anyone else had even noticed the change in his vital signs. "Where did you learn to do that?" Tank asked suddenly. The big SEAL had been watching Sarah work from across the room, and his question cut through the controlled chaos like a knife. Sarah paused for just a moment, her hands stilling on Jackson's pulse point. "Medical school," she replied evenly, but her voice carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "No," Tank said slowly, shaking his head. "That wasn't textbook medicine. That was battlefield triage. I've seen enough combat medics to know the difference." The medical bay fell silent except for the beeping of monitoring equipment and Jackson's labored breathing. Even the injured SEALs turned their attention to the conversation, sensing an undercurrent they didn't understand. Sarah resumed her work without responding, but Jake could see the subtle changes in her posture. Her shoulders had tensed almost imperceptibly, and her movements became more controlled, more deliberate. It was the body language of someone preparing for a threat. "Tank's right," Jake said quietly. "I've been watching you for 3 years, Doc. You move like someone with combat experience. Your reaction times, your decision-making under pressure, the way you prioritize injuries, it's not something you learn in a civilian hospital." Sarah finished adjusting Jackson's splint before turning to face the room full of SEALs. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Jake caught a flicker of something else in her eyes. Fear? Anger? He couldn't be sure. "I'm a medic," she said simply. "I treat injuries. That's all you need to know." But Tank wasn't satisfied with that answer. "Come on, Doc, we're not asking for classified information. We just want to know who we're working with." "Where did you serve?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the men she had been treating for 3 years. These were warriors who had trusted her with their lives, who had welcomed her into their brotherhood without question. Now that trust felt fragile, dependent on answers she wasn't prepared to give. "I didn't serve," she lied, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. Jake stepped closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "Sarah, we've all seen enough to recognize our own. Whatever happened, wherever you served, it doesn't change anything here. We just want to understand." For a moment, Sarah's carefully constructed walls began to crack. The weight of 3 years of silence, of pretending to be someone she wasn't, pressed down on her shoulders. She looked at Jackson, still pale and in pain on the examination table, and saw other faces from another time. Young soldiers who hadn't made it home. Friends who had died in her arms despite everything she had done to save them. "Some things are better left buried," she whispered, more to herself than to the room. "Not when they're eating you alive," Jake replied. His voice carried a understanding that made Sarah look up sharply. "We've all got ghosts, Doc, but you don't have to carry them alone." The offer of understanding, of acceptance, was almost too much for Sarah to bear. For 3 years, she had convinced herself that isolation was safety, that distance was protection. But standing in this room full of warriors who knew exactly what it meant to carry invisible wounds, she felt the first crack in the armor she had built around her heart. Before she could respond, the emergency alarm sounded again. This time it was different. 4 long blasts that meant incoming casualties from an active combat zone. Real injuries from real bullets and real explosions. Sarah's moment of vulnerability vanished as her training took over. "Clear the bay," she ordered, her voice suddenly carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Get Davis and Jackson to the base hospital. We're about to have company." The SEALs moved to comply, but Jake lingered for a moment longer. "This conversation isn't over, Doc," he said quietly. Sarah met his eyes steadily. "Yes, it is," she replied. But even as she said the words, she knew they were both lying. Some conversations once started have a way of finishing themselves whether we want them to or not. The helicopter touched down 20 minutes later, carrying casualties from a reconnaissance mission gone wrong in Afghanistan. Sarah had prepared the medical bay with the efficiency of someone who had done this countless times before. But as the first stretcher came through the door, she felt her breath catch in her throat. The wounded SEAL was young, maybe 22, with the same dark hair and serious eyes that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. For a split second, her mind transported her back to a forward operating base in Kandahar, to another young soldier who had looked at her with the same mixture of pain and trust as he died in her arms. "Doc." The urgent call from Hospital Corpsman Peterson snapped Sarah back to the present. "Multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen. He's lost a lot of blood." Sarah moved quickly to the stretcher, pushing the memories aside as she assessed the injuries. 3 bullet wounds in a tight pattern across the SEAL's torso. Evidence of close-range automatic weapons fire. His pulse was weak and rapid, blood pressure dropping despite the IV fluids they had been pumping into him during transport. "Get me 2 units of O- and prep the OR," Sarah commanded, her hands already working to cut away the blood-soaked uniform. "And call the base hospital. We need a surgeon here in 10 minutes. As she worked to stabilize the injured SEAL, more casualties arrived. A staff sergeant with a compound fracture of the femur, a petty officer with shrapnel wounds across his back, and finally carried between 2 of his teammates, a SEAL whose right leg was missing below the knee. The medical bay transformed into a scene that was all too familiar to Sarah. The controlled chaos of battlefield medicine, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. She moved between the casualties with practiced efficiency, triaging injuries and prioritizing treatment based on years of experience she wasn't supposed to have. Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson arrived just as Sarah was, starting a blood transfusion on the most critically injured SEAL. Even with his own shoulder still bandaged, Jake immediately began assisting, following Sarah's orders without question. It was clear to him now that whoever Dr. Sarah Chen had been before becoming their base medic, she had been very good at what she did. "Talk to me." "Doc," Jake said quietly as he helped elevate the wounded SEAL's legs. "How bad is it?" "Touch and go," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "He's lost too much blood and at least one bullet is still in there. We need to get him to surgery immediately." As if summoned by her words, Dr. Marcus Webb, the base's chief surgeon, burst through the medical bay doors with a surgical team in tow. Webb was a Navy veteran himself, a man who had seen his share of combat casualties during tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. "What do you have for me, Chen?" Webb asked, immediately moving to examine the most critical patient. 22-year-old male, 3 GSWs to the torso, Sarah reported with military precision. "Entry wounds here, here, and here. No exit wounds visible. Blood pressure is 70/40 and dropping despite 2 liters of fluids. Pulse is 120 and weak." Webb nodded grimly as he examined the wounds. "Good work stabilizing him. We need to move now." As the surgical team prepared to transport the wounded SEAL to the operating room, he grabbed Sarah's hand weakly. His eyes were unfocused from blood loss, but his grip was desperate. "Don't let me die, Doc," he whispered. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had heard them before from another young soldier in another place and time. A soldier she hadn't been able to save despite everything she had tried. The memory threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to focus on the present. "You're not going to die," she told him firmly, her voice carrying a conviction that came from deep personal experience. "Dr. Webb is the best surgeon on the West Coast. You're going to be fine." As the surgical team wheeled the SEAL away, Sarah turned her attention to the other casualties. The staff sergeant with the compound fracture was stable, but needed immediate orthopedic surgery. The petty officer with shrapnel wounds required careful cleaning and suturing, but would make a full recovery. And the SEAL who had lost his leg needed immediate attention to prevent infection and prepare the wound for eventual prosthetic fitting. It was while treating this last casualty that Sarah's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack. As she cleaned and dressed the amputation site, her hands began to shake almost imperceptibly. The steady, sure movements that had characterized her work for 3 years suddenly became uncertain. Jake noticed immediately. He had been watching Sarah work throughout the crisis, and he had seen something in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror on difficult days. The haunted look of someone reliving traumatic memories while trying to function in the present. "Chen," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "You need to take a break." "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. "No, you're not," Jake said gently. "And that's okay. We've all been there." Sarah looked up at him sharply, and for a moment her professional mask slipped completely. Jake saw pain and exhaustion and guilt that went far beyond anything that could be explained by the current crisis. It was the expression of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and blamed themselves for things that were beyond their control. "I can't stop," she whispered. "If I stop, I'll think about things I can't think about." The admission hung between them like a confession. Jake understood completely. It was the same reason he threw himself into mission after mission, the same reason many warriors kept pushing forward even when their bodies and minds begged for rest. "The kid's going to be okay," Jake said quietly. "Webb's the best there is. And this one," he gestured to the SEAL Sarah was treating, "he's tough as nails. Lost his leg, but he's already talking about when he can start training with a prosthetic." Sarah nodded, but Jake could see she was struggling to maintain control. The combination of stress, exhaustion, and triggered memories was taking its toll. He made a decision that would change everything for both of them. "Sarah," he said, using her first name instead of the professional Doc, for the first time in 3 years. "Whatever happened to you, wherever you served, you saved lives today. Just like you've been saving lives here for 3 years. That matters. It all matters. The kindness in his voice, the understanding and acceptance was almost Sarah's undoing. For 3 years, she had built her life around the premise that her past was too dark, too painful, too complicated for anyone else to understand. But standing in this medical bay, surrounded by the controlled chaos of treating wounded warriors, she felt the first stirring of something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. 3 hours later, the medical bay had returned to its usual state of organized calm. The wounded SEALs had been treated and transferred to appropriate facilities, and Sarah was mechanically cleaning her instruments when Dr. Webb returned from surgery with news about the most critically injured patient. "He's going to make it," Webb announced as he entered the medical bay. "Touch and go for a while, but he's stable now. Nice work on the initial treatment, Chen. Your field medicine probably saved his life." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but didn't trust herself to speak. The relief she felt was overwhelming, mixed with memories of other young soldiers she hadn't been able to save. Webb noticed her unusual quietness but attributed it to the stress of the day's events. "Why don't you head home early?" Webb suggested. "It's been a long day and you've more than earned some rest." "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically, but even she could hear the exhaustion in her own voice. Jake, who had remained in the medical bay to complete his incident report, looked up from his paperwork. "Doc, when's the last time you took a real day off?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had taken leave. Work had become her refuge, her way of avoiding the quiet moments when memories had a chance to surface. "I don't need time off," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Tank Williams chose that moment to arrive for his scheduled follow-up appointment. The massive SEAL took one look at Sarah's pale face and exhausted posture and made an executive decision. "That's it," Tank announced in his characteristic booming voice. "Chen, you're coming with us to Rosie's bar tonight. No arguments." Sarah shook her head immediately. "I don't drink." "Then you can have a Coke and watch us drink," Tank replied cheerfully. "But you're coming. It's not healthy. All this working and no playing." "Tank's right," Jake added, surprising Sarah with his support. "The team always gets together after difficult missions. It helps process things." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of panic at the thought of social interaction outside the controlled environment of the medical bay. For 3 years, she had successfully avoided any situation that might lead to personal questions or unwanted scrutiny of her past. "I really should stay and finish my reports," she began, but Jake cut her off. "The reports can wait until tomorrow. What can't wait is dealing with what happened today." His voice carried a gentle authority that made it clear this wasn't really a request. An hour later, Sarah found herself seated in a dimly lit corner booth at Rosie's Bar, a local establishment that had become the unofficial gathering place for off-duty SEALs. She nursed a Coke while watching Jake, Tank, and several other team members decompress from the day's events over beer and war stories. At first, Sarah felt completely out of place. The casual banter and good-natured ribbing that characterized SEAL camaraderie was foreign to her after years of professional distance. But gradually she began to relax as she realized that no one was pressing her for personal information or expecting her to participate beyond her comfort level. "Remember that mission in Nigeria when Peterson got so scared he forgot how to tie his boots?" Tank was saying, gesturing broadly with his beer bottle. "Hey, those weren't regular combat boots," Peterson protested from across the table. "They were some weird African Special Forces gear, and I was under fire." The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive, the kind of bonding that happens between people who have shared dangerous experiences. Sarah found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. "What about you, Doc?" Jake asked suddenly. "Any funny medical stories from your training days?" The question was casual, but Sarah felt her defenses immediately snap back into place. Everyone at the table turned to look at her expectantly, and she felt trapped by their attention. "Medical school wasn't exactly filled with funny moments," she replied carefully. "Come on," Tank encouraged. "Every doctor has at least one story about a patient who did something stupid." Sarah was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Petty Officer Martinez, who had just returned from the base hospital where he had been visiting the wounded SEALs from that morning's mission. "Good news," Martinez announced as he slid into the booth. "The kid from Afghanistan is awake and asking for the doc who saved his life. He wants to thank you personally, Chen." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt the color drain from her face as memories she had spent 3 years suppressing came flooding back. Another young soldier in another hospital bed, asking for the medic who couldn't save him. The guilt and grief that had driven her to leave the army and try to disappear into civilian life. "I need some air," Sarah said abruptly, standing up so quickly that she nearly knocked over her drink. She pushed through the crowded bar toward the exit, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The walls seemed to be closing in around her, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors and gunfire that existed only in her memory. Jake followed her outside, finding her leaning against the building with her hands pressed against her temples. In the harsh light of the parking lot security lamps, he could see that she was trembling. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, gently, maintaining his distance so she wouldn't feel cornered. "I'm fine," she said automatically, but her voice was shaking. "Just needed some fresh air." That wasn't just needing air, Jake observed. That was a panic attack. "I've had enough of them to recognize the signs." Sarah looked up at him sharply, surprised by his honesty about his own struggles. In her experience, military personnel rarely admitted to psychological difficulties. "You?" she asked despite herself. Jake nodded. "After my 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. Couldn't handle crowded spaces for months. Still have trouble sometimes when things get too intense." The admission created a moment of connection that Sarah hadn't expected. For the first time since arriving at Coronado, she was talking to someone who might actually understand what she was going through. "The kid who got shot today," Sarah said quietly. "He reminded me of someone." "Someone you lost?" Jake asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the understanding in his eyes. "Want to talk about it?" he offered. For a moment, Sarah considered it. The weight of carrying her secrets alone had become almost unbearable, and the events of the day had cracked the walls she had built around her past. But fear won out over hope, as it had for 3 years. "I can't," she whispered. Jake nodded, accepting her limitation without judgment. "When you're ready," he said simply, "we'll be here." The simple promise of acceptance without conditions or demands for immediate disclosure was more than Sarah had dared hope for in years. As they stood together in the parking lot, she felt something shift inside her. The isolation that had protected her was also destroying her, and for the first time she began to consider that maybe there was another way to live. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the medical bay. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert "Ghost" Anderson was a legend among Navy SEALs, a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. At 52, he had served in every major conflict of the past 3 decades and was known for his ability to see through any facade or deception. Sarah was updating patient files when Ghost walked through the medical bay doors. She had seen him before during his occasional visits to the base, but they had never spoken directly. His presence immediately commanded attention. Even in the informal atmosphere of the medical facility, "Dr. Chen," Ghost said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We need to talk." Sarah felt her stomach drop. After the previous night's episode at Rosie's bar, she had been dreading some kind of official inquiry into her background. Ghost's appearance seemed to confirm her worst fears. "Of course, Master Chief," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" Ghost studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes taking in details that most people would miss. Finally, he gestured toward her office. "Privately," he said. Sarah led him into her small office adjacent to the medical bay, closing the door behind them. Ghost remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a parade rest position that had probably become second nature after decades of military service. "I've been reviewing the incident reports from yesterday's casualties." Ghost began without preamble. "Your medical decisions were exemplary. Quick thinking, proper prioritization, textbook trauma care under pressure." Sarah waited, knowing there was more coming. Men like Ghost didn't make social calls to discuss routine medical procedures. "The interesting thing," Ghost continued, "is that your techniques weren't textbook at all. They were field-tested, combat-proven methods that you don't learn in civilian medical school." The statement hung in the air between them like an accusation. Sarah felt her carefully constructed defenses rising, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I've had extensive trauma training," she said carefully. "Yes, you have," Ghost agreed. "The question is where and when. Because according to your personnel file, Dr. Sarah Chen graduated from Stanford Medical School, completed her residency at UCSF, and came to work for the Navy as a civilian contractor 3 years ago. Clean record, excellent references, no military background whatsoever. Sarah's mouth went dry. If Ghost had been investigating her background, it meant someone suspected something. The life she had built at Coronado was starting to crumble. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "Master Chief," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Ghost stepped closer, his expression softening slightly. "I'm not implying anything, Dr. Chen. I'm stating facts. And the fact is that whoever you were before you became Sarah Chen, you were one hell of a combat medic." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had believed her cover identity was perfect, that no one would ever connect Dr. Sarah Chen with Captain Lisa Morgan, the Army medic who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before disappearing into civilian life, after a mission that went catastrophically wrong. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said weakly, but even she could hear that the denial sounded hollow. Ghost reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, laying it on Sarah's desk. It was a grainy surveillance photo from a forward operating base in Afghanistan, showing a woman in Army combat fatigues treating wounded soldiers. The woman's face was partially obscured by her helmet, but the build and posture were unmistakably familiar. "Captain Lisa Morgan," Ghost said quietly, "awarded the Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism during the Battle of Marja, and according to Army records, killed in action during a classified mission in Kandahar province 3 years ago." Sarah stared at the photograph, memories flooding back despite her efforts to suppress them. She remembered that day clearly: the smell of cordite and blood, the sound of incoming mortar rounds, the weight of responsibility as the only medic for an entire platoon of soldiers who depended on her to bring them home alive. "She's dead," Sarah whispered, and she wasn't entirely lying. The woman in that photograph, the soldier who had believed in the mission and trusted the system, had died that day in Afghanistan even if her body had survived. "Maybe," Ghost said, "but her skills live on in you, and yesterday those skills saved the life of one of my men." Sarah looked up at him, confusion replacing fear. "I don't understand. If you know who I am, why aren't you reporting it?" Ghost smiled for the first time since entering her office. "Because I also know why you disappeared, Captain. I know about the mission that went wrong. I know about the soldiers you lost despite doing everything humanly possible to save them. And I know that sometimes the only way to survive is to become someone else entirely." The understanding in his voice was almost more than Sarah could bear. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of her past alone, convinced that no one would understand the choices she had made, or the guilt that drove her to seek anonymity. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I suspected from the beginning," Ghost admitted. "Your medical techniques, your reaction to combat situations, the way you move, it all pointed to military training. But I wasn't sure until yesterday. The way you handled those casualties, the decisions you made under pressure, that was pure combat experience." Sarah slumped in her chair, the weight of maintaining her deception finally lifting from her shoulders. "What happens now?" "That depends," Ghost said, sitting down across from her. "The question is whether you're ready to stop running from who you are." "I can't go back," Sarah said immediately. "The Army thinks I'm dead, and there are reasons it needs to stay that way." "I'm not talking about going back to the Army," Ghost clarified. "I'm talking about accepting who you are right here, right now. These men trust you, Sarah. They depend on you. And after yesterday, they've started to suspect that their medic has secrets that might explain why she's so good at what she does." Sarah thought about Jake's gentle probing, Tank's observations about her combat skills, and the way the entire team had rallied around her during the crisis. For 3 years, she had kept them at arm's length, convinced that distance was safety. But yesterday had shown her something different, a team that would accept her regardless of her past, if she could find the courage to trust them. "They're starting to ask questions," she admitted. "Good men always do," Ghost replied. "The question is whether you're going to keep lying to them or start trusting them with the truth." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the growing emotional cost of living a lie. Finally, she looked up at Ghost with something approaching hope in her eyes. "If I tell them, what happens to Dr. Sarah Chen?" "She continues being the best combat medic the SEALs have ever had," Ghost said simply, just with a little more honesty about where she learned her skills. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility that her past didn't have to be a burden she carried alone. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a strength she shared with people who would understand exactly what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to carry the weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances. "There's something else you should know," Ghost added, his expression growing serious. "The young SEAL you saved yesterday, he's been asking specifically for Captain Morgan. Apparently his older brother served under you in Afghanistan, and told him stories about the medic who saved his life during the Battle of Marja." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What's his name?" "Petty Officer David Rodriguez. His brother was Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, who you treated for severe abdominal wounds during a Taliban ambush in 2022. The memory hit Sarah like a lightning bolt. Miguel Rodriguez, a brave young soldier who had taken shrapnel to the gut while trying to rescue a wounded teammate. She had worked on him for hours in a field hospital under constant mortar fire, refusing to give up even when others said it was hopeless. "Miguel made it home," she whispered, remembering the relief she had felt when she learned he had survived the flight to Germany. He did. And he never forgot the medic who saved his life. He used to tell his little brother stories about Captain Morgan, the combat medic who could work miracles under fire. Ghost stood up, straightening his uniform. "David Rodriguez doesn't know that his hero is sitting in a medical bay at Coronado, hiding behind a false name. But he deserves to know that the person who saved his life yesterday is the same person who saved his brother's life 2 years ago." The weight of that revelation settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She had spent 3 years running from her past, trying to forget the soldiers she had saved and the ones she couldn't. But perhaps it was time to stop running and start remembering that for every life she had lost, there were others she had saved. "I need time to think," Sarah said finally. Ghost nodded, moving toward the door. "Take all the time you need, Captain. But remember, hiding who you are doesn't protect you from the pain. It just prevents you from healing from it." As Ghost left her office, Sarah sat alone with the photograph of Captain Lisa Morgan, combat medic and decorated soldier. For 3 years she had tried to bury that woman, convinced that her failures outweighed her successes. But maybe it was time to let her live again, scars and all. That afternoon, Sarah found herself standing outside the intensive care unit at the base hospital, staring through the glass at Petty Officer David Rodriguez. The young SEAL was awake now, his chest wrapped in bandages but his eyes alert and focused. According to the nursing staff, he had been asking repeatedly for the medic who had saved his life. Sarah had been standing there for 10 minutes, unable to decide whether to go in or walk away. Ghost's revelation about David's connection to his brother Miguel had shattered the last of her emotional defenses. The past she had tried so hard to escape was demanding to be acknowledged. "Going to stand out here all day, Doc?" Jake's voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to find him approaching with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. Even with his shoulders still bandaged from his own recent injuries, he had made the trip to check on his wounded teammate. "He's been asking for you," Jake said gently. "The nurses say he won't rest until he gets to thank you personally." Sarah nodded, but her feet remained frozen in place. "Jake, there are things about me that you don't know, things that might change how you and the team see me." Jake studied her face carefully. "Does it change the fact that you saved his life yesterday?" "No," Sarah admitted. "Does it change the fact that you've been taking care of us for 3 years?" "No." "Then whatever it is, it doesn't matter to us." Jake's voice carried a conviction that made Sarah look at him sharply. "We're a team, Doc. Teams don't abandon each other over past mistakes or secrets." The simple declaration of loyalty was almost overwhelming. Sarah had spent so long believing that her past made her unworthy of acceptance, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something bigger than herself. "What if I told you that Dr. Sarah—" "Chen isn't my real name?" she asked quietly. Jake didn't even blink. "Then I'd say that whoever you were before, you're one of us now. Names don't change that." The acceptance in his voice gave Sarah the courage she needed to push open the door to David's room. The young SEAL's face lit up when he saw her, and he struggled to sit up straighter despite his injuries. "Doc, I've been waiting for you," David said, his voice still weak but filled with gratitude. "I wanted to thank you for saving my life." Sarah approached his bedside slowly, her medical training automatically assessing his condition. Color was good, breathing was clear, and his monitors showed stable vital signs. He would make a full recovery. Just doing my job, Sarah replied, falling back on the professional distance that had protected her for 3 years. No, David said firmly. What you did was way beyond just doing your job. I remember everything, even though I was pretty messed up. The way you stayed calm, the way you knew exactly what to do, you reminded me of someone. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Oh? David's expression grew thoughtful. My older brother Miguel served in Afghanistan. He used to tell me stories about this incredible combat medic who saved his life during a really bad firefight. Captain Morgan, her name was. The way Miguel described her, she sounded just like you. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 3 years of silence and pain. Sarah could see the recognition beginning to dawn in David's eyes as he studied her face more carefully. Miguel said Captain Morgan was killed in action. David continued slowly. But sometimes when I look at you, I wonder. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She pulled up a chair beside David's bed and sat down, her hands folded in her lap. What would you say if I told you that Captain Morgan didn't die in Afghanistan? She asked quietly. David's eyes widened. I'd say that would be the best news I've heard in 3 years. Miguel still talks about her. Says she was the bravest person he ever knew. She wasn't brave, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was terrified every single day. Terrified of making a mistake, of losing someone, of not being good enough when it mattered most. Understanding flooded David's face. Doc, are you telling me? Sarah nodded slowly. Captain Lisa Morgan. 3rd Infantry Division, 1st Brigade Combat Team. I treated your brother during the Battle of Marja in March 2022. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Tears formed in his eyes as he stared at the woman who had become a legend in his family's stories. Miguel said you worked on him for 6 hours straight while the base was under mortar attack. David whispered. He said you wouldn't give up even when everyone else said it was hopeless. Sarah remembered that night clearly. The smell of smoke and blood, the constant thunder of incoming artillery, and the weight of knowing that Miguel's life hung in the balance of every decision she made. She had been so focused on saving him that she had barely noticed the chaos around them. He was dying, Sarah said simply. I couldn't let that happen. But the army said you were killed, David continued. Miguel went to your memorial service. Sarah's expression grew distant as she remembered the mission that had ended her military career and nearly ended her life. Sometimes people need to die in order to survive, she said cryptically. Before David could ask for clarification, Jake appeared in the doorway. He had been waiting outside, giving them privacy for their conversation. But the emotional weight of what was happening had drawn him back. Everything okay in here? Jake asked, though it was clear from the tears on David's face and Sarah's pale complexion that something significant had just occurred. David looked at Jake with wonder still evident in his eyes. Jake, do you know who our medic really is? Jake glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small nod of permission. I'm starting to get an idea, Jake replied carefully. She's Captain Morgan, David said with reverence, the combat medic who saved my brother's life in Afghanistan. The one they said was killed in action. Jake felt the pieces of a 3-year puzzle finally clicking into place. Sarah's combat skills, her reaction to wounded soldiers, her reluctance to discuss her past. It all made sense now. Well, Jake said after a moment of stunned silence, that explains why you're the best medic any of us have ever worked with. The simple acceptance in his voice broke something loose inside Sarah. After 3 years of hiding, of pretending to be someone else, of carrying the weight of her past alone, she was finally being seen for who she really was. And instead of rejection or judgment, she found understanding and respect. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Captain Lisa Morgan allowed herself to believe that maybe she could stop running from who she had been and start building something new from who she was becoming. Word spread quickly through the SEAL community at Coronado. By evening, the medical bay was filled with team members who had come to see their medic with new eyes. Sarah sat at her desk completing paperwork, while conversations buzzed around her in hushed, respectful tones. Tank Williams was the first to approach her directly. The massive SEAL pulled up a chair and sat down heavily, his usual boisterous demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. Captain, he began awkwardly. I owe you an apology. All those times I pushed you to talk about your past, I thought you were just being shy. I didn't realize you were carrying that kind of weight. Sarah looked up from her charts. You don't need to apologize, Tank, and you don't need to call me Captain. I'm not that person anymore. Maybe not, Tank replied. But you're still the person who earned a Bronze Star for treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire. You're still the person who received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. Those things don't just disappear because you changed your name. Around the medical bay, other SEALs nodded in agreement. Master Chief Ghost had shared enough of Sarah's military record to paint a picture of a combat medic whose reputation for courage and skill had become legendary among those who served alongside her. The thing is, Tank continued, we always knew there was something special about you. The way you never panicked no matter how bad things got. The way you seemed to know exactly what to do in situations that would break other people. Now we understand why. Petty Officer Martinez joined the conversation. My cousin served with the 3rd Infantry Division. He was there during the Battle of Marja. He still talks about Captain Morgan like she was some kind of miracle worker. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the acceptance and respect in their voices. For 3 years she had convinced herself that her military service was something to hide from. Something that marked her as damaged goods. But these men, warriors themselves, saw her past as a source of strength rather than shame. I'm not a hero, Sarah said quietly. I lost soldiers. Good soldiers who trusted me to bring them home. And I couldn't save them all. Jake stepped forward from where he had been listening near the door. Doc, how many soldiers did you treat during your 3 deployments? Sarah thought for a moment. I don't know exactly, hundreds. And how many did you lose? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was the calculation she had avoided making for 3 years, too afraid of the answer to face the mathematics of her service. 17, she whispered. The number was burned into her memory, along with each of their faces and the circumstances of their deaths. 17 out of hundreds, Jake said gently. That's not failure, Sarah, that's miraculous. Most combat medics would kill for those kinds of statistics. But they were real people, Sarah protested, with families and futures and dreams, and I couldn't save them. Master Chief Ghost, who had been quietly observing from the corner, finally spoke up. Captain, I've read your after-action reports. Every single one of those 17 soldiers died from injuries that would have been fatal, regardless of who was treating them. Traumatic brain injuries, catastrophic blood loss, damage that was simply incompatible with life. You didn't fail them. You gave them dignity in their final moments and comfort when they needed it most. The words hung in the air as Sarah struggled with emotions she had buried for 3 years. The guilt that had driven her to fake her own death and disappear into civilian life was being challenged by people who understood the realities of combat medicine. Why did you leave? Asked Petty Officer Peterson, his voice gentle with genuine curiosity. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, gathering the courage to share the story she had never told anyone. Finally, she began to speak. The last mission was supposed to be routine, medical support for a small reconnaissance patrol in Kandahar province, but we walked into an ambush. Her voice grew distant as she relived the memories. 5 soldiers wounded in the first 30 seconds. 2 killed instantly, and I was the only medic. The medical bay had grown completely silent. Even the usual background noise of medical equipment seemed muted as Sarah continued her story. I worked on them for 4 hours while we waited for extraction. No supplies except what I carried in my aid bag. No backup, no support. Just me and 5 dying soldiers who were counting on me to keep them alive. Sarah's hands began to shake as the memories overwhelmed her defenses. I saved 3 of them, but 2 died in my arms while I was trying to decide who to treat first. 19 and 20 years old, and they died because I made the wrong choice about who needed help more urgently. Jake moved closer, his expression full of understanding. Sarah, that's not how triage works. You know that. In a mass casualty situation, you have to make impossible choices. It doesn't make you responsible for the outcome. It felt like it did, Sarah whispered. After that, I couldn't function anymore. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't trust my own medical judgment. The Army wanted to send me to counseling, but I knew I was done. So I arranged to disappear. Faked your own death? Tank asked, his voice filled with amazement rather than judgment. Sarah nodded. The mission went wrong in more ways than one. There was an explosion that separated me from my unit. In the chaos, it was easy to let everyone believe I had been killed. I made my way to a refugee camp, then to a medical charity that helped me get back to the United States with new identification. The room remained silent as the SEALs processed the magnitude of what Sarah had shared. Finally, Ghost spoke up. "And then you came here, where you could still practice medicine but without the pressure of active combat." "I thought it would be easier," Sarah admitted. "I thought treating training injuries and routine medical problems would let me use my skills without having to face life-and-death decisions anymore." "But life had other plans," Jake observed with a slight smile. Sarah nodded, thinking of all the emergency situations she had handled over the past 3 years. "Turns out SEALs get into just as much trouble as infantry soldiers, just in different ways." The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive, the kind of bonding that happens when people share difficult truths and find acceptance instead of judgment. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere. "So what happens now?" she asked, looking around at the faces of the men who had become her family. "Now," Ghost said with authority, "Captain Lisa Morgan continues serving as the finest combat medic the Navy SEALs have ever had. Except this time, she does it as herself instead of hiding behind someone else's identity. And," Tank added with a grin, "she starts coming to team barbecues and poker games like a normal member of the family." Sarah smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The silence that had protected her for 3 years was finally broken, replaced by the voices of people who understood exactly what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to carry the invisible wounds of war. She was no longer Dr. Sarah Chen, the mysterious medic with no past. She was Captain Lisa Morgan, decorated combat veteran and the best damn medic the SEALs had ever had, and for the first time in 3 years that felt like enough.